this probably has to do with measurement, and again, very emblematic of who the king is during this period. In fact, oh, there we go. That's a much better, I knew I had a better picture here. Another motif that we're seeing, this tree, this sort of central tree with these odd things hanging off of the side. It's possible this is a date palm. Date palms are linked to fertility for a number of reasons. They're actually sexed. They're male and female. Date palms you can't just put date palms together. You have to make sure you have a male date palm and a female date palm so that they produce dates, which could be used for wine, for food. And they create, they actually have these bushels of dates which fall along the sides. Date palms are going to be very important later on as well. So this is probably one of our first depictions of the date palm and its association with the divine. And again, it doesn't look very much like a date palm. It looks more like a tree, but often these plants that we'll see, these sacred plants, are combinations of different real types of plants. Just like our gods can combine elements of reality, these sacred trees can do the same. So we'll be seeing more of that, again, just to bring your attention to it so you can keep in mind. Keep it in mind for later in the semester. In the lower register, we see a procession scene similar to what we've come to expect in cylinder seals. And in this case, right, the god, again, probably Nana, is leading our king Ur-Nammu, again, clearly identified by the same sort of headgear that Gudea wears, that woolen cap. And he's carrying a set of tools. He's actually carrying, as you can see here, a hoe. He's carrying what looks to be an axe, emphasizing, again, the role of the king as builder. We can see in some of the upper registers as well, I'm sorry, not the upper register, but the lower register, that same attention to building, probably again the construction of a temple, very, very speculative, but we do have little bits that do survive, a ladder here, and these baskets, the carrying of baskets by these individuals, baskets that we've seen, if we go back to the Stele of the Vultures, right? These individuals carrying baskets, but right, that difference being that that they're building a temple, where in this case, with the Stele of the Vultures, in this case they're building a mountain of the dead. And this is something we've seen elsewhere in the Ur-3 period, right? If you remember the Ur-Nanshe plaque we looked at, that emphasis again, king as builder, he who creates these things. In this case, right, we have Ur-Nanshe carrying a basket on his head as well. This motif continues not just in carvings of stele, but also in the creation of objects. These are really interesting objects. They're foundation figurines that begin during this period. They're developed by Gudea and Ur-Nammu. There are some examples from the early dynastic period in simpler form, but in this case they're fully fleshed out. And these foundation figurines were buried along with other items, often valuable items, in vulnerable parts of buildings. So specifically points of transition, doorways or corners, places that are dark where you cross, sections where the building might be vulnerable. A lot of times they were inscribed or accompanied with a stone or a tablet that would dedicate the building, and also say how these objects should be used. The idea being that not only are you ritually protecting the building from harm, but you're also really clearly stating, who created it. This is something we do today, right? We create foundation stones, right? When a new building is built in San Francisco, there's the cornerstone, which is inscribed with the people who, paid to build the building. In the same sense, this is taking place during the Ur-3 period. And later kings who would come and renovate these structures and would dig them up would find these objects and be able to, there was a sense that later on in the future, these objects could be found and would legitimize and glorify the people who are building these buildings. We see two types of these figurines. Both of them are based on the human form and take the form of the king. And you can see in this one, actually, they take the form of a peg. And these guys would be found in the corners often of buildings, of temples. It's not quite clear why they're peg-shaped, but maybe it has something to do with symbolically anchoring down the corners of the temple. In later Hittite texts, which we'll come to, we do see a ritual where the temple or the building is compared to a tent that needs to be anchored down. So that might be an explanation for the peg. But certainly we've seen pegs and cones in earlier periods too, ritual pegs. So again, during the Ur III period, Ur itself becomes the center. And at the site, while we don't have a tremendous amount of art, the architecture is quite spectacular. It's during this period that Ur-Nama is able to, using the resources of this state, construct what really is the first true ziggurat in Mesopotamia. And this is the ziggurat of Temenirgu, the dedicatory name of the ziggurat. It's dedicated to Nana, and it's called the house whose foundation creates terror. It's quite something. It's very, very big. It's 190 feet by 130 feet, rectangular, not square. And unfortunately, only 2 levels survive. There are thought to be 3 in all. But this is a massive, massive structure. Again, recalling what we've seen in earlier periods, right, with the temple sequence at Eridu, and the White Temple, the Anu Ziggurat at Uruk, these proto-ziggurats. Now we see this raised temple in its fully fleshed and final form as a ziggurat. To build something this big, it really took not just a lot of effort, not just a lot of organization, but some very interesting engineering. The building itself, every 6 to 8 courses of brick, you actually find reed matting, which would have helped to actually give the building a little bit more structure and a little bit more resiliency. If you think of shock absorbers, right? If you just stack a whole bunch of bricks up, you're going to get a very unstable structure. But by laying in every 6 bricks a big segment of reed matting, you give the structure a bit more resiliency. Also, these reed mats were soaked in bitumen, which is almost a form of tar, which would help to preserve the outside and the core of this massive, massive platform. The outside of the platform was actually encased in baked brick, not mud brick, right? But baked brick. These were fired intentionally so they would be super hard and provide a lot of support. The core was actually a mud brick core with these reed mats inside it. So a lot of experimentation taking place during this time. You can see it was approached by 3 separate staircases, 1 from the front and 2 from the sides. And unfortunately, the temple itself, right, this is just the platform, but the temple to Nana, which would have been at the top of this structure, doesn't survive. Like Uruk, Ur is a very flat place, so the presence of a structure like this would have been seen for miles and miles around. It was restored by a number of rulers. Later, Nabonidus in 550 BCE restores it. He uses his bricks to actually restore it, so you can actually follow the history of this structure by looking at the bricks. They're stamped with Ur-Nammu at the bottom. The upper ones are stamped by later kings like Nabonidus. And in fact, we actually have bricks that were stamped by Saddam Hussein in the 1980s, who created and restored the outside of this temple. It's interesting. I mean, this is wonderful archaeologically, right? Because we can see who and when these structures were built, like when they were built and who they were built by. They really provide a wonderful chronology. In this case, right, we have a stamped brick from the time of Amar-Sin, a later king, the grandson of Ur-Nammu. And it reads, Amar-Sin, the one who called by name the god Enlil and Nippur, supporter of the temple of the god, mighty king of Ur, king of the four corners of the god Enki, his beloved lord, built this temple and his Absu for him. Again, leaving no question as to who is taking credit for the creation of this structure. Similarly, right, we actually have this one from Saddam Hussein. It says, in the era of Saddam Hussein, protector of Iraq, he who rebuilt civilization and rebuilt Ur. It's a little ironic that these bricks that Saddam put in place actually ended up cracking and falling apart 10 years after he used them, and they had to be fixed and changed. This is unfortunate too. Actually, this is a brick. It went for sale recently on Christie's website. It was sold for about $5,000. And I wanted to show you this one too. Again, these sites during the war in Iraq in 2003 with the U.S. invasion, these sites actually, because of their elevation, because of their strategic location, were used as modern military outposts, and troops were stationed here at that time. So there's a shot of the troops walking up the ziggurat at Ur. So history repeats itself. I wanted to take a look at some of these other structures that we have. So again, you can see the ziggurat of Ur-Nammu, this massive, massive ziggurat surrounded by a retaining wall. We have some other interesting buildings from this period. Again, if you remember, we were talking about our royal tombs of Ur, right? They're still down here from preceding periods. But again, these Third Dynasty buildings, we have something called the Enun-Ma, which is thought to, because of its massive, very thick defensive walls and these long corridors, it's thought to be a storage house, a treasury, if you will, again, of all of this material, which is being accrued by the Balas tax and coming to Ur for redistribution. You're going to need to put that someplace, and you're going to need to put it in a very safe place where it can be regulated, as we saw through all these texts. And this is where we think that would have been. Another structure, the E-Hersag of Ur-Nammu and Sholgi. Just looking at this structure, right, comparing it to, say, these other ones, what might you think this structure is? Just looking at its ground plan. We've got a temple, we've got a storage house. A residence, yeah, absolutely, right? This is probably a palace. And if you remember, we saw palaces as early as Ebla, and later the palace of Naram-Sin. One of the key points, again, being a throne room, and also, right, which probably would have been here. Actually, I'm sorry, it probably would have been here, adjacent to a large